Good morning, everyone. It's wonderful to see you on this beautiful morning in Austin, Texas, my hometown. And thank you, as Yves said, in joining the family reunion, friend reunion, colleague reunion today. As we all know, affordable housing advocacy is a team sport, and it is not for the faint of heart. Lots of times that don't feel like wins, don't feel like we're gaining. And it's so important for us to build the bridges, build the authentic relationships that it requires to sustain the fuel, energy, and love that it takes to continue this work. Now, as someone who is not an economist, but now works at a company where we have 300 million unique visitors to our site every month connecting to jobs, I have never used the words, let's see what the macroeconomic environment is looking like more than I ever have in the last 3 months because everyone is watching so closely. And I'm so excited today to have Caitlin and Diana to talk about how our workers, how our human beings, how our community members experiencing this moment in our macroeconomic environment. So I'm going to kick off by asking you and welcoming you, Caitlin. Tell us a little bit about the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation, what you focus on there, and if you don't mind, begin by telling us one of the most compelling books you've read lately.
So in terms of books, I have a 3-year-old and a 9-month-old, so if you haven't read the Elephant and Piggy series, I mean, you are missing out. It keeps you totally engaged the whole way through, great rhymes. I also would recommend Grumpy Monkey, but you know, I would say though, in terms of, for my job books that I found really interesting is probably 2017, I read a book called End of Average by Todd Rose. I don't know if anyone's familiar with it, sort of multiple years ago, but I picked it back up recently because the whole premise of the book is that there is no average. We design our entire lives, certainly in the education career, we design it for the average student. You know, at 9 years old, an average student should know and be able to do this, and we actually know that there absolutely is no average kid. And so it really makes the case for the personalization of learning and the personalization of school. And I find that to be an interesting topic post-pandemic because personalizing school looked a lot like Zoom, right? The word personalization and school, when you say that to a parent right now, they're like, oh yeah, I saw what that was. It was a Zoom classroom and I don't want any part of that. And, taking part in a Zoom gym class, I can understand, right? That makes sense. But I think it's just a really interesting moment in time to be thinking about what that actually means and how do we make that possible in a moment in time where we know kids are, they have lost huge amounts of learning loss over the past 2 years. And there's never been a more important time to engage them in the way that they learn best, and that's going to be different for every kid. So I'll say that as my book, and then the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation, we're the world's largest trade association, representing millions of businesses, every size, sector, and region. And the Chamber Foundation focuses primarily in education and workforce because this is an issue that's facing every region, every zip code. There are as many chambers as there are zip codes. There are as many chambers as there are school districts. They aren't, there's no relationship between the two other than the fact that we all think about business in the same way and the power that business has in the same way. And I do spend a huge amount of time working with chambers. I will shout out to Austin Chamber, which is one of the best in the country. How chambers are thinking about the changing workforce in this moment in time is really the center point of my work. Trying to sort of provide them with innovative opportunities that exist in states across the country, but also trying to figure out challenges that have rippled as a result of the pandemic And not surprisingly, you know, when you're talking about a workforce challenge, which is real, and a challenge that almost every company is facing right now, it's also a place that you need to think about housing and childcare and transportation and all of the other things that, like, if you fix one, great, but like there's a whole other ripple that comes from that. So that's where we've been spending a lot of time.
Thank you. And I want to give a shout out to Allie, who's here from the Austin Chamber you just mentioned. So, Diana, your turn. So, tell us about yourself, your focus areas. You're going to present some data and tell us about your book.
Okay. Diana Elliott. I am Vice President of U.S. Programs at Population Reference Bureau. We are a small but mighty organization based in Washington, D.C. We also have offices, however, in Dakar, Senegal, and also in Nairobi, Kenya. So it's the first time I've worked in a very long time at an organization where we're looking at the U.S., but also connected to other places internationally. And my portfolio is US-based, but we have an international program as well that thinks about and looks at some of these same population trends, issues related to health and well-being and the environment. So it's really wonderful to kind of expand my understanding, not only beyond the US, but internationally. And generally what we do is a lot of research for policymakers. It's research that, again, looks at population trends, tries to understand who we are and where we're going. So some of our work, for example, looks at projections. So we do work for small governments and regional governments, trying to understand how to plan. What's it going to look like in 5 to 10 years in terms of our population, and how can we create roads and schools and infrastructure to support that? And also some of our work looks at children and children's well-being. And some of the work that I really enjoy doing is related to the workforce and the labor force, thinking about population in those terms. My favorite book, or most compelling book, really hard. And I have to admit, I've been watching a lot more Netflix since the pandemic than reading, so. But I would say that I'm going on a trip to Portugal in April. I'm really excited about that, so I'm reading a lot of travel books. But in terms of something that's compelling, last year I read a book called Cloud Cuckoo Land. And I don't know if you know the author Anthony Doerr. He wrote all the things we cannot see, all the light we cannot see. But it's a really interesting book because it's very much of a place and time, right? I think he's drawing from our experiences with the pandemic and what we're all experiencing in terms of loss and new experiences, but it's also connected through time, through one story. It's really lovely. And I think, again, as a population researcher and a social scientist, and for all of you as well, it's really important to remember that it's not just Austin experiencing a lot of these things, we're experiencing these things everywhere, not just in this country, but internationally as well. And so having that perspective, I think, really helps us, particularly in terms of policy, to think about what other places are doing and how we can benefit from those collective and creative ideas.
Great. And I think you're going to help us with some additional data. So
I am. Okay, great. All right, thanks.
Okay, so I'll present some population trends from the demographic perspective, because one of my big frustrations with the way media coverage has gone in terms of the labor shortages and worker shortages is that we're not thinking about sort of these broader level trends in population. We're thinking on a very, it's workers having challenges, it's employers having challenges, but actually we're going through a collective change in our country. So again, I wrote a blog because I was so frustrated by the media coverage that I wanted to get it all on paper. So a lot of these talking points are from that blog, and that's available in the program if you link to it. But a deeper understanding of demographics really illuminates why there just aren't a lot of workers right now for these available jobs. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the changing age structure in our country, increased death rate. That's really hard for us to hear, but it's a really important dynamic as well. And then immigration and why that's creating a worker shortage as well. So first of all, I love this photo so much because I feel like this is what we would love everyone to feel in retirement. Between 2000 and 2022, the median age increased by 3.4 years overall in our country. We have become an older country. This is not just something that's happening here, this is happening in a lot of countries right now. You'll hear about this in Europe, you're hearing about this in Asia. We are aging. The share of working age people shrank. So it was 64.9% in recently, 2022. The peak in 2007, right before the recession, was 67.3%. A lot of people exited the workforce during the Great Recession. We saw some of the same patterns happen again during COVID. And those people don't necessarily come back, or they don't come back steadily. All baby boomers right now are of an age where they can access either their own retirement savings, or most of them can access both that and Social Security now. So I point this out because there's this belief, and I have a couple slides that show this, that people who are older will come back. They generally don't. Since 2007, total fertility rates are well below replacement. Why do I bring that up? Because 2007, those people who were born in 2007 were age 15. They are now of working age. We simply don't have enough young people who have been born to replace people who have retired. So we're entering an era where there's just fewer young Americans being born to replace people who've retired. So I share this is a crazy graph, and I only share the red, which is the US, and the black, which is other OECD countries. So these are wealthy countries that we generally compare ourselves to. And the US has gone down. The share of working age people has gone down since that high of 2007. I like to imagine this in your head. Guess a country that's higher and guess a country that's lower. Just think about one in your head. And then I'll share with you that the one that always stands out to me is Canada is higher, and Japan is much lower. You'll read a lot in the news right now about Japan's becoming an aging country, and this is affecting workforce, this is affecting their housing, this is affecting all areas of their economy right now. In contrast, Canada, much younger than we are. Why? Canada, a decade or so ago, implemented different immigration policies. Okay, this slide. This is really just to point out that over 65 group, you'll see out of the labor force, they're a much smaller share than younger people even. Why do I point that out? Again, there's a lot of news stories that talk about older workers being, this salvation for our worker shortages. Sure, maybe some people will stay in or will come back from time to time, but this is generally people retire and they don't come back when they retire. And again, I point this out because in these groups, retirees tend to say a date or have a date in mind or a year in mind when they're going to retire. They tend to retire sooner than that age. All important to keep in context. This is the slide that brings everyone down, but it's really important to create this context. Since 2010, death rates have risen for young and older adults. So our prime working age population, we have had an increase in death rates in this group. COVID, and again, this is because of various reasons: drug overdoses, alcohol, suicide, diabetes, obesity-related health conditions related to the heart and blood pressure. COVID-19 exacerbated this trend. Excuse me. In fact, if you look at the share of the working age population, you'll see a definite dip in 2020 and 2021. Further, long COVID might be depressing what this general trend looks like. Again, we don't have a lot of information on who has long COVID, how that affects their workforce participation, but we do know that not everyone is able to work to the full capacity after they have had COVID. I show this slide also to have the international comparison. I think this is really important here. This is working age adults, age 18 to 24, and their excess mortality. This comes from a brief that Population Reference Bureau, my organization, put out called Dying Young. And you'll see that the United States is a real outlier here relative to other countries. There are a lot of reasons for this, but a lot of these can be traced back to policy decisions that we have made here in our country versus other countries. This is a little bit more upbeat, maybe. This is about immigration. So between 2010 and 2018, immigrants and their US-born children were estimated to be 28% of all workers and contributes 83% of labor force growth. That is really significant in the overall. But in recent years, immigration policies have created systemic backlogs. So, and this not just because of COVID-19, this has sort of been a growing problem, but COVID-19 did not help. Literally the borders were closed and people could not come into our country even if they had valid work permits. But between 2021 and 2022, our country added population, and that million people that we added is attributed to immigration. So we are not growing on our own, we are only growing because of immigrants coming into this country. I say that this helps in the short term, not necessarily the long term. What does that mean? Short-term changes in the backlog will certainly help, but we need to long-term systemically think about how to change immigration policies if we care about having more workers. What does the future of the labor market look like? I include this because demography is not destiny, and we can change a lot of this through policy. So the US is really notable for lack of family-friendly policies internationally. We are one of those countries that always ranks towards the bottom. We are missing out on a lot of labor force potential because we do not have policies that enable people to work and successfully also care for their families. And that's not just young children, that's also the aging population. We're gonna have people increasingly coming out of the workforce to care for aging parents. COVID-19 is a great example of what happened. A lot of working mothers, disproportionately women of color, and I'll say look at some of the work that the Federal Reserve of Minneapolis has done on this, had to leave work because of school and closures. And so we are missing out, they haven't all returned, and we are missing out on that potential in terms of our labor market. Employer policies matter too. There's a lot of conversation now about return to office policies. These are not necessarily beneficial for everyone. Again, this curbs working parents' ability to navigate work and school. We have a lot of people who are, again, still dealing with COVID and the aftermaths of COVID. And we have people with disabilities who, again, tons of untapped potential in that group in terms of our labor force. But, and they had an uptick in labor force participation during COVID. But my concern is that some of these return to office policies will create another downtick. Hiring policies are another great example. Employers have this within their realm to change too. So those that exclude justice-involved people, again, further limit that pool of available workers. So these are all really important dynamics to consider, and we're going to talk about this next. So.
Thank you so much, Diana, for walking us through that. And I wonder, Caitlin, if you want to pick up on a couple of those big changes that Diana talked about from the pandemic and what you see in the areas that you focus on.
Yeah. So first, I think where we left off with some of the return to work opportunities and challenges that exist, like depending on what industry you're in. If you're in the healthcare industry, you're likely not going to be able to work remote, right? If you're in the manufacturing industry, you're likely not going to be able to work remote. And obviously, there's a huge amount of industries that just, there's a place that you have to go. But then there's also a large amount of work that can be done remotely, and I think one thing the pandemic has done in a positive light is provided employees sort of a greater role in making some of these decisions for themselves. And, you know, an issue near and dear to my heart, both because of the policy, but also because I'm a working mom and have 2 young kids that are in childcare. One of which is, she's been on the list since I was 12 weeks pregnant and still not in childcare because there's no infant seats available. They're like, you know, understanding that parents have excess responsibilities outside of just their 9-to-5 job, or as we all know, 9 to 5 is like 9 to whenever, you know, 7 a.m. to whenever I go to sleep, and I'm constantly emailing between. Like, understanding that there is wraparound in that, I think employers have come to the table in a way, and, you know, maybe childcare was a benefit to the pandemic because we all had one moment in time where like lights were just shut out and all of a sudden we were zooming into everyone's living room and their like little kid was on their lap, and or, you know, their 3-year-old was on Zoom class, or their 8-year-old was doing, you know, gym. It was, you know, you had a life-changing moment where we were all seeing our coworkers in very, very, very different experience. And so that has led now 3 years later to conversations around like, okay, what benefits do we need to think about changing for our employees as, you know, it pertains to childcare? That was very, like, prior to the pandemic, there were very few companies, despite many, many, many reports talking about the economic impact that, you know, how this affects the bottom line. And, you know, there were few companies that you could find that were providing these type of benefits to employees, and now that has changed dramatically. We're looking at stipends, we're looking at on-care, on-site care, where places that you have to show up, right? Like hospitals, manufacturing centers, you know, beyond. And then also sort of expanding those, understanding, you know, mental health is a huge aspect of the challenges that we've all seen in the midst of the pandemic, and providing wraparound services for employees while they're dealing with all of the ripples that we've just, you know, sort of all collectively gone through, not just as a country, but as a world. Those are just a few places that I've seen some real, not just interest in having conversations about it, but interest in trying to figure out the role that companies play and the role that, you know, the trends that they can start moving because they're engaging in it more purposefully.
Yeah, so in the interest of putting a few positives on the board, so what I'm hearing you say is that although very, very difficult circumstances came to light during the pandemic, especially when it comes to the holistic needs of workers, that forced more and more employers to confront that. And in fact, in a tight labor market, not only because of the numbers you showed, Diana, but for lots of reasons, employers are feeling, increasingly at least, that they need to step up to meet those holistic needs. That's certainly something we preach at Indeed to the employers who are competing for talent, that you will do better if you are thinking about all of those wraparound needs of your workforce. What else do you want to call out in terms of what maybe could be on the positive side of the ledger with changes to the workforce?
Again, I'll reiterate the piece from earlier, which is some of the policies inadvertently helped. Like, again, remote work policies inadvertently helped some groups, right? Again, people with disabilities. This is a huge, huge potential untapped market in our labor force. And it's not because the talent's not there, it's because the circumstances and also discrimination prevents them from basically having the same labor force participation that everyone else does. So the remote environment helped a lot of people access jobs who otherwise couldn't have accessed them. And, you know, I think if we're going to talk about housing and workforce, right, workers through the pandemic, this is like a bright spot, I think, were able to leave high-cost places and go to places that were lower cost for their families. Now, there's some sort of catch-up factor where some of those places have become higher cost as well. But it was a way for people to, again, right-size their family balance sheet and to, again, have meaningful work, but not necessarily have these really high costs. Savings went up during that period for various reasons, right? And I think that that's another indicator that when you don't have to spend for a lot of other additional expenses, and when you can choose lower cost housing, if you're a renter or otherwise, that makes a big difference for your overall balance sheet.
I want to take a moment to remind you about the Slido, which is open. So if you just joined us and missed the instructions at the beginning, the QR code in the center of your table, you can use that to open up the flip book that has the digital agenda. And on the table of contents page, there's a link for the Slido. I want to move to that even more quickly than we planned, just because I want more of your voices in this conversation. Are we having any populate just yet? Seal, do you know if there are any Slido questions popping up just yet? As we turn to that, yep, there are a few in there, so start upvoting and adding yours. Before we turn to those, I'd love to ask each of you about any innovations you've observed during this time, and then tie that to what the people in gathered here today can get behind. What can we each do to advance some of those innovative solutions?
Yeah, I think that, the pandemic has allowed people to almost take a reset at some of the, when you're thinking about business practices, the pandemic has given you an opportunity to take a reset and figure out what are your values, what are you focused on, and certainly in the talent crisis, we call it, what are you looking for when you are hiring? I think, you would probably know better than most that at Indeed that, companies are not looking to hire for a 6-month turnaround, right? You're looking for a long-term commitment, and that also takes a lot of push-pull from the organization itself, figuring out what an individual's needs are, figuring out where they can meet them to best serve the role that they want to play to make them sort of the best teammate that they can be. I think almost it feels as if there's been a shift in power because there's been a real talent shortage that we've all experienced. It doesn't really matter where you are sitting in this country, it's a challenge to get the right talent in the right place, and as a result, there is way more open conversations that are happening about what does that look like, what does this job mean, how can we, as a sort of partnership, build towards a prosperous future. And a lot of that is work-life balance. Like you were saying prior, you have a 9 and 6-year-old, right? And I have a 3-year-old and 9-month-old, and my work-life balance looks very, very different than it did 3 years ago, and I'm sure your work-life balance looks very different than it did even 3 years ago. So having those conversations and understanding that there are evolutions in an employee's life that are going to change where they are able to commit and what they're able to do and the expectations that they have from their employer and vice versa.
Right. Diana.
Okay. Well, I think, one of the innovations that I'd like to kind of see more of, I think we've seen a bit of this, again, with this talent shortage, we're seeing more employers recognize that they cannot get a ready-made worker fresh out of someone else's training program or fresh out of school, that they have to build those employees from within. So more training programs specifically created in-house or designed in-house to meet those talent needs, I think is a really important innovation. I think it's the one way that we can, again, advance some of these workforce challenges. I'll highlight one example, which I worked on a lot of projects on apprenticeship when I was at Urban Institute. Apprenticeship is this gold standard training program. You hire someone who doesn't necessarily have a degree, but they have potential. So you get them before you give them that opportunity to grow on the job, to get paid for that work. They're often local, so you're hiring talent who already has housing and doesn't need to necessarily worry about coming into your city, looking for housing, worrying about housing costs. They also are really eager and loyal because you've given them an opportunity. And then you get to train them in your processes, in your ways of working. It's a wonderful program. I'm constantly amazed that more employers aren't doing this. I'll give an example of this. I had a conversation with a very, very high level, like Fortune 50 CEO in a prior role, who did not understand what apprenticeship was, thought it was a novelty. And when this individual heard that Google had an apprenticeship program and that we were working with Google on this, I just read in the news 2 days ago that company now has an apprenticeship program. So there's a certain amount of healthy competition knowing that other people are doing this. It's also a really successful way to kind of bridge diversity, equity, inclusion interests in the workplace. So I think it's a really terrific innovation. Absolutely, yeah.
I would also say that apprenticeship is great and certainly a thing that we spend a lot of time on, but we've also moved, like certainly in the last 2 years, we've taken a hyperloop step into we're moved away from 4-year for all and moved into certificate, credentialing, badges. Yes, there's only a handful of apprenticeship programs that we can point to in the US right now, but we can point to a huge amount of credentials that allow you to get very similar foot in the door and then the on the ground, on the job training that we know is so important to getting this, to not just finding your career, but growing your career. You can start in one place and end at a totally different place, and understanding that is a winding road as opposed to the straight path that it used to be.
Absolutely agree. I would add that employers aren't necessarily convinced of credentials yet. And that's a gap that we have to bridge. I'll bring it back to apprenticeship a little bit and say that a well-designed apprenticeship program, you get work on the job and you get training from somewhere else, like a credentialing program. And there's some wonderful credentialing programs out there, but this is where those of us in the room can help, is sort of raising this to employers, saying this credentialing program is really high quality. Apprenticeship is a really great training program. Can we have an apprentice? At Urban Institute, prior to me leaving, we decided that we couldn't keep talking to employers without having our own apprentice. So we started our own youth apprenticeship program, and it was wonderful. It is wonderful. So, absolutely, think about how you can play that role at your workplace to bridge those gaps, help with this credentialing, sort of vetting of credentialing programs, bringing new people into the door in very creative ways.
Us as a supporter as well, we've increasingly been trying to educate employers about not only apprenticeships, but the importance of leading with skills when you're making hiring decisions instead of traditional degrees. So many reasons why folks who are often marginalized cannot access four-year degrees and those kinds of formal education. And so employers do better when they look at the skills rather than degrees. Let's go to the first top voting question. There's been a little bit of a race to the top. I've seen it go back and forth. Right now, the top one is, what is holding policymakers back at the federal level from increasing the federal minimum wage? It hasn't changed since 2009. Who would like to take this one?
Thanks. Politics. I think it's a really easy answer, right? It's politics. A lot of policy made at the federal level is not made thinking about what the best evidence actually is. So, and that's frustrating for someone like me who does think at the federal level. One of the reasons I went to Urban Institute was because I could work with local areas, right, that are thinking more creatively about this, right? In Austin, you're thinking really creatively about how to bridge some of these gaps. Cities are doing really creative and innovative things. It's not necessarily happening at the federal level.
Yeah, and it feels very obvious to say, but it's something that bears repeating, which, again, we've used our platform on Indeed. We have something called hiringlab.org where we publish a lot of data based on not only the Bureau of Labor Statistics, but also what we see on the millions of connections being made on our site. We have tried to underline the very clear correlation between not only being very transparent about your salary, if you're an employer looking to hire, you get many more applications and high quality applications if you're transparent about the salary of the job you're posting for. But obviously, not only the higher your wages or the better your benefits and the more clear you are about them, again, the higher application rate you get and the better the applicants. So it's worth all of us underlining that. I'm going to go to Sarah's question next. Why is declining population bad? And with increases in productivity, do we really need more workers?
Wow, that's a good question. Yes, declining population is a challenge. But again, demography is not destiny. So if there are advances in productivity where you do need fewer workers, great. But as you made the point earlier, right? I mean, there are certain jobs where we actually need somebody present. I'll give one great example: home healthcare workers. This ties back to immigration as well. In an aging population, there is tremendous need for home healthcare workers now. But if you look at projections for the next decade, it grows as that baby boom population starts to age. About 30%, give or take, depending on what data you read, of that population are foreign-born people. So it's all interrelated, right? That we need home healthcare workers because of the changing age structure. That's something where we can't replace those people with robots or different strategies necessarily. And fixing immigration would be helpful for having more home healthcare workers. So it's just an overall sort of package of things that we need to think about and worry about as our population starts to change.
Great. The next question is from Karen. Can you speak to the idea that AI will replace so many jobs? Is AI being considered as a positive solution to the decreasing workforce?
Yeah, it's so funny because this comes up a lot, and if you see the trends, like this has been the case for many, many, many years. We've had AI in so many words or less replacing jobs over and over. Think about, an ATM teller. You went to somebody, they gave you money, you walked away. Now we have an ATM that does that, and now we use our phone and we just see somebody and send it to them magically. So this has been happening over and over and over again. I think the real issue here is not so much that AI will replace, quote, so many jobs, but more that the jobs that we will have, we already know will require much more skill. So the, grocery attendant, we might not see in full force. We might not see, 12 on a shift anymore. We might see 3, but we are going to see an IT, a very skilled person that is able to track the movement, be able to use technology in a new way that's supporting the individuals that are shopping there, as opposed to one person that's standing. So that goes back to the skills need that we're going to be having, and certainly for somebody like me who spends a lot of time thinking about K-12, this is a place of real concern because we've seen a huge amount of learning loss occur over the last 2 years especially, and that was not just, we can't just say that's the pandemic, move on, because we were seeing these trends actually prior to the pandemic. We were seeing drops in NAEP scores, and this has only been exacerbated because of the last 2 years, and certainly a lot of kids at the same time being out of school, and a huge amount of kids just being digitally truant, just gone, right? That we have no numbers on, and a lot of them have not returned. I think some of that is you can sort of pull out from Fed presentation that we just did. So this is a skills challenge that we're dealing with right now, and it's going to be a skills challenge that we are going to see throughout the next decade or more.
The next question asks, bringing us back to housing, how have you all seen large employers, universities, hospitals, cities use their dollars, land, and more to address evolving workforce needs? I guess it's actually more than housing. I thought for a minute it was, yeah. So anyway, what do you think?
Well, I can make sort of again, creative reuse of internal funds, right? So if you think about how much it costs to recruit someone, particularly in a very high demand field, right? So that might be computer programmers or sort of specialists in that way. It's a lot of money, and you're not guaranteed to have them for very long. But if you can convince an employer that if you use that money to instead train someone who might be sort of hired because of their skills or a credential and then train them up, you can get more bang for your buck. You'll save money and you'll have less churn overall. But it's a hard argument to make sometimes because you'll just say, well, this is the way we've always done it. I think this is a moment in time where we need to push employers and others to think more creatively, because these solutions that worked in the past are not necessarily working now or in the future.
I'll just add that, similar to what I think we've talked about earlier, like a lot of the different use cases for these dollars have been to figure out real challenges like childcare that they know are affecting their employees' ability to come to work. This is obviously seen most in second shift or third shift, and it's not just hospitals, like think logistics centers, think any place that an employee needs to go. Childcare has been a major barrier, and I think there's been a huge amount of work to figure out how do we use this land to create a place for kids to go, a trusted place for kids. That's half the battle, is having a place that parents trust to be able to put their child. And a lot of times, if that's close to where they work, they feel like they have the ability to go and check in at any moment. And that gives them, it sort of raises that trust factor. But the number one thing that we've seen large employers, and this is large employers, small employers, you name it, it is also the easiest thing that you can do, which is to just survey your workforce and figure out where the pain points are. You can't solve a problem you don't know about. And also, if you're trying to solve a problem that you think you know, but you actually haven't really figured out, you're ultimately not solving the right problem. And so what we've seen is, even for, I can call it a large logistics center, they were having a huge challenge with their second shift workers. And they were calling out most frequently because of childcare issues. They surveyed to figure out if they should put millions of dollars in R&D to create an on-site childcare center that would allow them a place. And actually what they came back with was predictive scheduling would change my life. If I knew every Tuesday, every Thursday, every Saturday, and every Monday I was gonna have second shift, I could figure it out. Because I'd rather my child to be at my parents' house or my family friend or neighbors, right? Like, if I just knew that I was going to be responsible for these days, I could figure it out. But every 2 weeks, we're changing the game, and that makes it impossible for me, right? And so that was figuring out the need and finding the solution to that need, and that was a lot easier than spending millions of dollars to create a childcare center.
Great. So the next question says, some communities make the development of housing far more difficult than it needs to be, which harms low and middle income earners. How do we stop this? Well, first you come to Housing Works Conference and Summit every year. What else would you all add?
Oh, that's a really tough question.
It is a tough question, and I think we probably spend a lot of time on federal and less time on state, but there are a lot of regulations at the state level, as you all know. There are a lot of regulations at the local level, and it is tough because we're all trying to solve the same problem in very, very, very different ways to cut at the apple when depending on what zip code you're standing in. And so I would just say that look, like part of it is like obviously this is amazing. Like not every city has this to go to a wealth of information to walk back to and say, okay, what do we do now? But like sharing that to other communities and figuring out where their pain points were and how they solved it often like allows you to already prove, like to provide the proof of concept that you didn't know existed. We try to spend a lot of time thinking through that with our state and local chambers across the country to figure out like who's dealing with what issue, who's already solved it, and how do we matchmake to make sure that we're making sure that good innovative things can happen other places without reinventing the wheel from scratch.
Well, I don't think we should toot our own horn too much about Austin because it is very difficult here to develop affordable housing. So do not copy us, other cities, but do copy our community and our advocacy. I'll add something. I think it's increasingly important to identify the interdependence, the intersectionality of all the issues you all have talked about just now to housing. For far too long, I think we've got our child care advocates here, we have our education advocates here, we have our housing advocates here, we have our, reform the criminal legal system over here. And it is all tied together. You fix one, you're not actually doing enough to improve the daily lives of the people that we all say we care about unless we tie it together. So until we see our interests as sort of integral to one another's, we're not going to be able to fix it here in Austin or the other communities looking our way. So, next question. How big of an impact to the labor market would we see with more generous paid family leave policies and more care options for young children?
In Texas alone, it would be, let me see my notes, the U.S. Chamber U.S. Chamber Foundation did a report called Untapped Potential in Texas. If I don't have the link in the book, I will get you the link in the book, but it calls out a $9.39 billion total economic loss annually due to childcare. And $1.8 billion estimated in annual loss in tax revenue in Texas because of childcare issues, directly related to childcare. $1.8 billion in just tax revenue. Think what you could do with $1.8 billion in tax revenue. Probably a lot. And so, like, what does that mean for what does fixing that mean for not just this state, but for the country? Obviously, it's huge, but to many of the conversations that I heard leading up to this panel, we know that that's not just an easy fix, right? Like this is a very, very challenged system, from the cost of care to the cost for employees, the low wage work, the high rent challenges, all of that, right? And then in terms of paid family leave, I think the easiest way to answer that question is we know what that looks like in other countries. And so you can easily sort of suss out what that means here. I think, having 0 weeks is a big challenge. I do think that companies have gone have sort of gone leaps and bounds with that issue in the last couple of years, where a lot are providing 16 weeks of paid leave or 8 weeks of paid leave on their own. And of course, like some of that hand has been forced because of local or even state regulations that have said, okay, we're as a state gonna do 8 weeks, or that's Washington State has an 8 weeks policy, whereas Massachusetts has a 16-week policy, whereas DC has a 4-week policy, right? Like it looks really different depending on where you are, and if you're an employer that's working in multiple states, you typically just have to find the highest and make that universal, because it's so impossible to do all of the differing reporting mechanisms for all these separate ones, you sort of find the biggest and then just make that universal. So I think that that's probably something that for workers certainly look at as a major selling point when you're searching for a company to spend your time. But yeah, I mean, it's not been a conversation that they've had in trying to find the right word, but it's not been a conversation that's happened on the Hill where they found a lot of agreement on what that weeks look like, or what that could be for the U.S.
And I will just add, it's a great question. I'll just add, from someone who's sort of in that sandwich generation, the paid family leave and the massive impact it would have helps not only care options for young children, but also for people taking care of the elderly and older generations. Huge issue. Okay, Dea's back with another question that I'll combine with the next one. They're both about guaranteed income, universal basic income, and how it would help this landscape and help people pursue new work opportunities and entrepreneurship.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, the COVID period and things like child tax credit gave us a little microcosm into what happened and some of the various income supports that happened during that period. And I think you'll find that people used, if they were laid off, they could use that time and then those income supports to pursue other trainings available. So one of the organizations I previously worked with does an apprenticeship training project. They have this great example of a worker who had been laid off from a fast casual dining facility during the pandemic, and was sort of like underselling themselves in the job market. Had some college training, was interested in IT, went through their training program, and is now working in IT successfully. Right, use that period to invest in themselves because of income supports, because of unemployment. They were able to use that pause and those supports to retrain and to find a better paying and more sustainable long-term job. So I think if we had more of those supports that were predictable and readily available, we would see a lot of changes in terms of how people are training. Now, it doesn't necessarily deal with the shortages in hospitality or in other sort of fields like that, the fast casual chain. But it does allow people who maybe were, again, underselling their skills in the job market to upskill and find better opportunities.
Great. The next question I'm seeing is, has the percentage of women workers increased when compared to 10 to 20 years ago?
We have stalled. Yeah, and it's very upsetting to me to look at those numbers and to know that we're stalled. I think 1997 or some in the 90s was sort of a high point for women's labor force participation. And again, if you think about how challenging balancing a lot of these competing interests are, especially family, whether you have young children or whether you have elder family members to care for, caregiving comes back to women in this country and in most countries. So we have other work to do on that front as well. This conversation won't solve that either. But women's labor force participation has stalled, and we're missing a lot of really valuable talent because we don't have more supportive policies in this country.
Thank you. The next question's from Commissioner Howard. New research from UT says Texas ranks 49th in state investment in affordable housing. Do any states do well supporting workers, parents, and housing?
I don't think so.
Other than 48 others.
48 others.
Marginally better. Marginally better. Yeah, no, I don't. I liked your point earlier, Parisa, about how interconnected these ideas are. One thing I come back to frequently when I talk to people about this is housing development, economic development, and workforce development are all the same issue, right? You can't fix just one and think that the other two areas are, right? So if you have affordable housing, you'll have more workers in your area who will then support your economy and make it more attractive to have businesses locate there or to expand. If you're missing one piece of that tripod though, you'll have challenges. So I think thinking more holistically about these issues is key.
Well, and I'm thinking about the billions you just mentioned, that paid family leave would generate an increased revenue for a state.
Just childcare.
Childcare.
Or whatever, yeah.
And what could we do with that revenue? We could potentially invest in more affordable housing in this state, not to mention public education. So we are starting to run low on time, so I encourage you to upvote any question before we run out of time that you want to see answered, or enter your question and campaign to get it upvoted. Travis County has the most ambitious remote work policy of any local government in the United States. We're seeing a big jump in quality job applicants. Why do employers fear the remote work policies?
You know, I think because there's a little bit of like, this is how it's always been. We've always shown up. I think another thing that employers talk a lot about is the idea around just like camaraderie, like feeling connected to your workplace. You know, this is an important factor when we look at like long-term commitments to locations. If you're going to stay at a company for longer than 2 years, which tends to be about the time that you start like looking, you know, you get there's no more 7-year itch, it's the 2-year itch, right? Well, if you want to change that, you've got to create company culture. And I think there's a fear around how do you create company culture if there's no having a chat. Oh, I saw you in the hallway, or I saw you in the elevator, right? Like, how do we do that in a meaningful way if you're just on a screen? And like, I don't know about you guys, but I went to a lot of virtual happy hours, and they are the worst. So I think there's a real fear of like, what does a virtual happy hour do to my company culture? But I also think, to your point, like there are benefits that far outweigh having that, you know, having the happy hour at 4 o'clock on, you know, once a quarter. And I think that also it's a place that employees, and I think that this is a benefit that like employers are asking more about how their employees feel about, you know, what do they want to see? And employees are saying, we want the flexibility. And so I think there's been a lot of shift to get there. But, you know, I think a bit of it is just true fear around how do we make this a team without being together.
And I'll plug again hiringlab.org. What we see in our data is that remote work is here to stay, not a pandemic trend. And while a lot of the headlines are about companies that are struggling with making that change or saying no to it, in the industries where it's possible, because again, many industries remote work is not possible, it is happening. So the ones who are fearing it are getting outnumbered by the ones who are actually embracing it, and they are, like the salary transparency or higher pay I described earlier, they are seeing higher quality job applicants according to our data.
I think too, though, that there's other fear happening, right? And I'm seeing this in Washington, D.C. I know this is happening in other cities. You haven't had workers return back downtown. So there's a lot of fear right now about what's going to happen to the state of downtown. To which I say, well, let's reimagine it, right? So I work in an office building right now where we are moving to another office building. We have too much space. We have a lot of people who work remote. Our office building, last I heard, is going to be converted to residential. So I think there's a lot of new creative ideas out there that we shouldn't be fearful of change, but I think it's human nature to be fearful of change. But I know that DC's mayor is really worried about this. Other mayors are worried about this. You just don't see the same traffic in downtown areas, and businesses are unfortunately closing. But it's a moment for reimagination.
Thanks for adding that. All right, transportation, a hidden, forgotten burden on workers. With work from home, higher purchase prices for cars and gas, is this something employers are tracking?
Yeah, it's funny. We just, I think this morning, released a small business index. I believe it was this morning, but I think this issue, along with a lot of others, small businesses feeling even more than they were just even last year. So like 53% of small businesses said that inflation was their absolute number one issue, and that relates to the cost of all of these things. That's up 30 percentage points from last year, which is just like kind of eye-opening to think about. I mean, I know that this pertains to a worker, but when you are a small business organization and you're also dealing with all of these costs, whether it be delivery fees, whether it be, right, like it's a place that, is really challenging all people at the exact same time. And it's a thing that I think is at the top of mind for everyone, whether it be a worker, whether it be a, large business, a small business, a nonprofit. Anyone is sort of trying to figure out, how do we do this when everything just costs more?
And I mean, I think this also ties to so many other things, just to break a few more of the categories. I mean, climate, even prior to the pandemic, I think a lot of companies were thinking about, I know my company was thinking about, one, we are going to not just have one office. Instead, we're going to have distributed offices around the city so people don't all jump on the same major arteries and create congestion. Let's let them work from different parts of the town. And let's start to pick a few days a week when you need to come in to, again, contribute less to congestion and costs for workers. But now it just feels like a huge convergence. There's a lot of talk in Austin about how much better the future will be, hopefully with more public transit available and in Austin. So the future, I hope, focuses a lot on this transportation issue. Diana, is there anything else you want to add?
No, I think that was really well stated.
Okay, we are in our last question, so I'm going to ask one more, and then I'm going to let you all make a final point about anything that maybe wasn't asked about. Has there been any change in the amenity? Oh, there's a tie. Wait a second. Okay. Just give it a minute to settle. Okay, sorry about you, Anonymous. Other Anonymous has won. In-migration of working age population to Austin has brought about higher housing costs and displacement pressures. How can we support workers already here?
A good question.
We're both like,
Well, I think I'll start while you.
Sure.
Okay, so this is partially what this whole day is about. So it's partially why we're talking about employers getting more invested in workforce housing. It's why the Austin Independent School District is looking at the fact that teachers can no longer afford to live in central or within the city limits of Austin. So not only is that creating a harder job for teachers to get to schools that they work at, it's actually meaning loss of good teachers to other districts where they can actually afford to live closer to the school. So let's continue to push the employers, whether they're governmental or non-governmental, to think about workforce housing. Let's think about how can employers actually be advocates for this, not even if they can't buy the land or don't have the land. How can they speak up on this issue in the way that the Commerce Foundation, the Chamber Foundation is doing more of? But this is real, and I want to give a shout out to some of the organizations that are building the voices, the power, the access to decision making that tenants and that the people who are increasingly being pushed out know how they can make change. So I'm looking at you, Austin Justice Coalition. I'm looking at you, BASTA. I'm looking at you, Workers Defense Project. People who are actually organizing and facilitating the mobilization of residents who are affected in this very concrete way to get to the table and have their voices heard at City Hall, at the County Commissioner's Court, wherever these decisions are being made, because it's going to take all of us. Anything else you'd like to add?
That was really great.
Okay, cool. I really care about this a lot, so thank you for asking that question. I'm going to hand it over to you to give us any closing points you want to make sure this. There are some amazing governmental leaders here from the city, county, state level here doing the innovative things that I do think we should toot their horns. I was joking earlier. There are some very good innovative things happening in Travis County and in Austin. There are nonprofit leaders here. There are developers here. What do you want them to hear from the vantage point you have?
Sure, I can go. I think long range. And this is not just the next year, 2 years, 5 years. This is like 10 years, 20 years. Because some of these overarching trends are not going to go away. The population will only get older. And again, what are the ripple effects from that? Well, we have then challenges filling job roles. We have changes in where people are going to need to be to care for older relatives or to find access to care. We aren't going to fix immigration immediately. This is a really big policy that also has become really political. And that is where, if we want to be more like Canada and have more working age population, we need to rethink how we're doing that in the US, and we need to clear some of these hurdles. One of the misconceptions about immigration is that as soon as you let someone in, they can work. There's a lag period before they can start working. So we need to just make some of these processes at the federal level more efficient.
I just want to start by saying thank you to Nora and to Julie and to everyone for inviting this conversation to happen. And I just, I think that probably much of what we touched on today hopefully makes the statement that this is one of several issues that all sort of collide at the exact same place, right? Like housing, childcare, transportation, elder care, you name it. It's all something that a worker is dealing with at the exact same time in sort of a new way because we all just experienced the last 2 years. And so I think the role that, organizations have right now to start talking about how do we solve this long term and where are our quick wins short term are so important to having this broader, to just talking about it, right? To just making sure that we're all understanding it from the same level, because it really is so ingrained in so many challenges that are facing metro areas across the country. And certainly Austin isn't alone in that. But the fact that you are coming together today as part of an annual event to talk about this is such an important step in the right direction. And so I, truly commend you for that. To have, this many people show up to talk about housing is huge.
Diana, thank you. Caitlin, thank you. Thank you all for your great questions. That concludes.